Today we're going to be sketching a snowy ridge. There's a kind of unmistakable beauty and calm which comes from those kind of places. And that is what we're going to be trying to capture today with just some simple ink and watercolour techniques. This photo that we're going to be sketching from is linked down below, and it actually comes from a trip I took a few years ago. I love my winter mountaineering, so we're there in the snow with our ice axes, basically having a bit of fun. And with that fun comes these amazing views. Not practical to really sketch them while you're there, it's a bit too cold. So we get to come back, sometimes even like today, years later, and just sketch and enjoy ourselves. So I am starting off, as ever, step one with my ink shapes. I'm just using my Platinum 3776 fountain pen, but I could use, any other pen really. The reason I'm using this pen is because I've got an ultra extra fine nib in it. Of course, we need the waterproof ink. That's important when we layer up our watercolours. But having that really fine starting point, it's a bit like having a 0.1 or a 0.2 millimeter fine liner. Having that really sort of clear, fine, narrow starting point lets us sketch without using a pencil first, and we're not laying these sort of excessively bold marks on the page. With a scene like this, getting the sense of perspective about right is quite important, because that's how you get the feeling of depth, the feeling of grandeur. It could be very easy to turn this sort of, basically it's a big triangle, isn't it? I mean, if we just make it really simple, we've got a triangle forming a ridge in front of us, and then we've got a little sort of triangle at the back forming another ridge. And it'd be very easy to turn them into anything else. And the way that we avoid that is by getting that feeling of perspective. Now, why is that important with our shapes? Well, because when we're thinking about shapes, we're just simplifying everything into squares and triangles and circles. And in here, you can probably identify a lot of geometric squares, rectangles, some triangles, some sort of sharp edges, and probably some more complex shapes as well in there. But the important thing, well, there's a couple of really important things. One is that as these things get closer to us, they get bigger. So that's a part of the sort of feeling of perspective, certainly the feeling of depth, that things are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The other is, because they're getting bigger, they have perspective. So if we're drawing a square and making it 3D, that is that we are now drawing a cube. Well, then what is happening is that we need to draw that cube so it's extending slightly as it gets closer, rather than just being a flat object. So we need to start early, focusing on these ideas. And with that focus, we can build up a pretty good idea of our scene rather quickly. So you can see all I'm doing here is just building in the lines, building in the shapes, working initially front to back, and now I'm just filling in some of those gaps. The other bit is there's an awful lot going on in nature. There's always just so much going on. And what we don't want to feel the need to do is draw absolutely everything. What we've got for that is a photo. If we want every bit of detail in there, we have our photo already. So instead, it's, for me, the idea of sketching, painting, drawing is about getting the information on the page that I want. So for example, here we've got this clear ridge which is in the front versus the distant faded ridge. So I don't need to draw every bit of this clear ridge, but by making one line, the sort of line which separates the two, nice and bold, we can bring that close ridge forward. Again, really just helping with the sense of depth, much like when we are thinking about the perspective and the size of our shapes. So think about the quality of the line we're using, the sort of weight of the line that we're using is also a really important part of this simple sketching process. And then we can sort of move around and start finding, right, what other details might be important. What we don't have yet is a lot of feeling of all those sort of craggy cliffs. And for me, again, that's a rather important part of this scene. So now I'm finding those craggy cliffs. I'm suggesting them with quite simple, simple shapes. Again, I'm just drawing kind of vertical and horizontal shapes within shapes to create that stepping stone feel with texture. And you'll notice again, I'm using lots of continuous lines. People often ask why I do that. Well, there's a good answer in a video I've released recently about 7 reasons why you might want to use continuous lines. One thing is it helps simplify. And in a natural scene like this, well, everything is connected, whether we want it to be or not. There are connections between everything. There's details everywhere. So using continuous lines to simplify, to create those connections, to make our image just intrinsically more interesting, I think is a very fun and valid way to draw. You don't have to, but I think it's really fun. And that's the main reason I think it's a useful sort of skill for me. But also, you know, it does develop other aspects of your art as well. And I'll go into great detail about that in my other video. And here you can see I'm just continuing to draw those shapes within shapes. So little vertical shapes, sort of narrow rectangles to craft the idea of this stepping stone like mountain. And then we can step into the background. And what I wanted to do here was, do you notice in the back we've got these sort of patch of light, this kind of line of light. And I wanted to have some ink which separates that apart. There's also a sort of patch of craggy cliffs in there, and again just drawing these simple vertical shapes, these narrow rectangles, pointy triangles, just to get that simple texture. Again, the idea of depth is to have more detail in the front, less in the back. So I've stepped away quickly from that background to make sure that our foreground stays in the front. In landscapes, that's a really important thing to do, because you can have a look in any landscape and you can find details everywhere. But again, we're sketching, so I actually only want the key details in key places. So for example, adding in that little person in the foreground who's going to become a little punch of colour at the end. And that's a sort of consideration you might want to start thinking about early. So here I'm thinking about contrast, just started adding in a little bits of hatching, which just provides the first ideas of shadow. Also adds some texture, which is great. But along with contrast, I'm thinking, where's my colour going to come from? Where's the sort of life? Look at the actual reference, and what do you see? You probably see blue, grey, blue, white, blue, a bit more blue, maybe some navy. You know, there's a lot of blue in there, and that's great. That's a really lovely, soft photo. For me, I want my art to be a little bit more lively. So if you look closely, and you might have to look on the reference, which I've popped up on my Pinterest. There's a link down below that you can find that on. You'll see there's a couple of walkers in there, and they have brightly coloured clothes. So that's a reason why, whilst thinking about contrast, I decided to add that little detail in. Adding people into landscapes isn't something you have to do, and many people, many professional, amazing landscape artists hate the idea because they just find it cliche. They think it's ruining the natural beauty of the scene and what their skills are, basically. But you know, if you want to, great, do it. For sketches, often it's really fun. We want to be able to draw people and add them in, and often, like here, we're adding them in for a good reason. So for me, I'm adding them in because I'm imagining there'll be a punch of colour. And here's my second person just coming in the foreground as well. That's our 2 people. I left this one till a bit later because they're kind of hidden behind a rock, and I wanted to start getting the rocks and that first sense of contrast in before I added them, because it's just their upper body, and I just felt more comfortable doing it that way. And now it's time to take a little step back. We've got actually that feeling of the cliff, sort of stepping stones coming down towards us. Not perfect, but it's definitely got the right feel, the right shape to it overall. And it's going to be now a little bit of that sort of joyous cacophony of blue, where we're just getting to add our colours. Now there's lots and lots going on here that we could sort of play with, and I'm actually just going to really focus on soft and gentle colours, and that's what I always do in my first stage, but especially here. And I'm going to be a little bit sneaky, try to preserve some of those areas of light. So here I'm just starting with very watery cobalt blue and cobalt turquoise, and just letting those sort of mix, blend, do their thing on the page, keeping this soft sky quite separate at the moment from the mountain. And look at the reference, that's quite accurate. Just look, if you squint, you'll just see a pretty well-defined block of darker value and above it, a pretty well defined block of lighter value. That's the sky versus the mountain. Now, blues are some of my favourite pigments, so I've got loads of different blues. Here's another one. This is Mayan Genuine Deep that I'm using. And I'm using it here because it has that more shadowy, murky feel, like in the reference. If you don't have a million blues, you're probably a much more sensible human being than I am. There's no need to have loads of these blues. This is just me finally taking them all out for a stroll together. What you could do is you just take, one or two blues, whatever you do have, and you can tone them up, tone them down. That's adding a little bit of darkness or adding a bit more water. You can also change them to be warmer or cooler by adding a little bit of sort of green to shift it slightly one way, or tiny bit of red to shift it slightly the other way. And just finding these tiny touches into one blue or two blues will actually get you probably a bigger range than I'm using. And I'm cheating and I'm being lazy. So there is no need to sort of have a palette with 15 different blues in it. It's completely unnecessary. It's also quite fun. So if you do want to explore different pigments, go for it. There's no reason not to, apart from financial and potentially, I'm losing some skills of mixing by not actively practicing my mixing more. Having popped in the Mayan blue in that foreground, you can see I can now have a look and go, you know what, my sky can be bolder, my sky can have a bit more, and whilst it's still wet, that's the time to play with your sky. I should probably do a video specifically on skies. I've done one a couple of years ago, but maybe it's time to update it. But for me, and this isn't hard fact, this isn't the only way to do it, but for me, and I know for Colin as well, who I often paint with, we both say, if you've touched your sky, don't touch it again. So when you popped your sky in and it's dried, anything on top of that will become a bit chaotic, a bit messy, too busy. So try not to touch it again. There, I just added a little spray. It's a granulation spray by Schmink. It's actually, I didn't know this when I bought it, it's actually just 100% ethanol. It's just alcohol. You can get similar effects with water sprays, but you can see the texture it produces, it immediately sort of pushes away all that water because alcohol and water don't mix well together. And you get this kind of granulating effect. And I tried to keep that granulating effect just in the mountain. And that, when it dries, so another Colin phraseology here, watercolours are actually waterproof. So when they're dried, watercolours are waterproof. So that texture will dry and it will provide that rocky textural feeling that we're after for this sketch, for this painting, without having to put in lots of effort into individual tiny brush strokes. Just coming back in with a slightly smaller brush here, and apologies for some of the autofocus. I've been on holiday and I hadn't set up my camera right for this filming, but just neating up some of those edges again to preserve that contrast, that well-defined light and dark contrast which is in the image. And with that, I'm just going to let this dry completely and come back. And when we come back, we'll be using our smaller brush and getting a bit more paint out. So I've got a little bit more lavender on one side. I've got a bit of cerulean blue chromium on another side. So far we've used cobalt blue, cobalt turquoise, Mayan blue, genuine deep. Now we've got lavender. Lavender is a really lovely colour. It's one of my favourite recent additions to my palette. It's yet to make it into a formal spot in my palette, but updates are coming soon. Again, this is because I discovered some of my, well, I think I should have known, but I sort of discovered some of my colours are toxic, and I just decided with that in mind, I should probably make some changes which are better for me, better for the environment, and make it easier to dispose of my colours safely and my waters safely. So look out for my video both on toxic watercolours, but also look out for my video where I will do some changes to my palette. That said, this lavender is a beautiful, you can see it for yourself, it's actually semi-opaque. So it's a bit like using a light gouache. It doesn't have a full transparent effect, which we often look for in watercolours, but with that comes this kind of lovely flat texture. It feels very in front of us, very forward, and that's great for painting these rocks, for example. This cerulean blue chromium, another paint, unfortunately, which has got a bit of toxic stuff in it, so I won't be using too much of it, but look at that rich, lovely, cool blue that you get from it, a really nice colour. It's so unfortunate in this world. So many of the nice things just aren't good for us or good for the planet. But there you go. One last hurrah for these paints. And then, not one last hurrah, but I'll be using them more cautiously in the future, having learnt what I've learnt. All I'm doing now is adding in these bolder colours. I've actually got a little bit of lunar black here now as well. So lunar black is a really heavily granulating, highly textured pigment. And I'm not using it so much for the colour, but what I'm doing is touching it in a few places and letting it spread out and granulate. Key to granulation is using plenty of water. If you just pop a heavily granulating pigment down with not much water, it will all just settle and it will cause this sort of odd, quite unpleasant looking wash. Well, not even wash, it's just a sort of mass of basically granules, and so it just doesn't look very nice. If you use them with lots of water, they'll spread, they'll separate, they'll cause amazing textures. And you can tell hopefully that a lot of what I'm doing in this session, this sketching, is aimed at producing those textures. So we've gone from soft wash where we use a granulating spray. We've focused even before that with lots of gentle hatching and finding these shapes within shapes. Now we're adding on an opaque or semi-opaque lavender. We're adding heavily granulating lunar colours. These are all, so there's a lunar range by Daniel Smith, which are all heavily granulating. And all of this, we got lots of blues and things, but the real focus is producing that contrast and those textures, which hopefully are going to go ahead and suggest that mountainous feel, because we're not trying to draw every bit, but we can still suggest it by letting the watercolours just play along, do their thing, have a bit of fun in there. And just still now, I'm just sort of looking around and seeing, where can I add a little bit of something? And this is going to take a little while. And you know, it's still, you can see the link for the video, can't you? This doesn't take me hours and hours and hours, and this is all in complete real time. But it's still a more thoughtful process. You sort of have to take a step back, literally just take a step back. When we're painting, it's very easy to get sucked in. In one sense, that can make us get rather sucked into our mistakes and the errors that we have made, and literally putting your canvas or your paper a little distance from you, half a meter, gives you that space where you can not see those mistakes anymore and actually see the bigger picture, because everything is filled with mistakes. If you go and examine like brilliant artist's work, you'll find things that you're like, oh, I wouldn't have been happy if I'd done that. But you never look that closely, and you're never looking with such critical eyes when we look at ours. Similarly, being able to step back and see the bigger picture lets you see the contrast. It lets you see where you've overworked an area because you've been ignoring another area which you didn't notice because your nose was buried deep into the canvas. And that's where I sort of think, oh, look, there's this big blank area on the right. That needs a bit of something, doesn't it? And I'm just using that soft lavender, lots of water to avoid it looking too opaque, to keep it in the distance, but also to give it that bit of tone. And the decision we've got to make is, at the moment, it's actually lighter than the sky. So that's not real, it's not realistic, but it also makes sure that it's actually distant from this foreground. So in these kind of decision-making processes, what we need to do is decide how much we want to make the art work, how much we want to make the art real, and real is a lot of different things. And that is the sort of the great fun, the challenge, and also the great fun of being an artist, of making decisions, of getting to play with your art. So let's see, we'll work gradually, adding little bits here, and you can see gradually with each touch we're adding darker and darker pigment. So that was even more lunar black, even darker. Little splashes also add that element of randomness, which is a good bit of fun. And then we can start adding in those bolder, brighter, really happy-go-lucky fun bits. This is our little red people. Now, one thing you might notice is it looks pretty bad, doesn't it? So I put this red down, and I think I had some lavender or black on my brush. And I immediately think, oh dear. Well, that's stuffed it, hasn't it? Well, I don't actually think it stuffed it, but I'm thinking it's not done quite what I wanted it to do. So I softened it out a little bit, add a little bit of water, let things sort of blend a bit, and then just take a step back. Now I know I've added lots of water to that red, so I know I've got time to come back. I also know, because I added lots of water, in the next couple of minutes it's going to change and move, and I might be more happy coming back to it in a second. And gradually it does change, it does move, and you can probably see now it looks softer, it looks less in your face, less let's say offensive than it did before. And now I'm happy with it. So I don't need to come back and touch it. I didn't need to overcorrect or overdo it. I could just give it time, let the watercolours do their thing. And now we get to move on to restructuring. And I'm going to do something a little bit different in this sketch today. And what is that magic cheating little trick I'm going to be doing? Well, it is of course using different kind of ink. So this is an alcohol based ink marker, a bit like a Posca pen or a Winsor Newton Pro marker. I've got a set of Winsor Newton Pro markers, but this just is a Cass Art own brand alcohol marker, and it's a neutral grey. And that's going to let me, without affecting much of the texture, apply quite a bold and specific contrast sort of shadow, well, neutral grey. You can see it's quite just adding some real depth, isn't it? And I can just move around using the chisel tip and really enhance the contrast very specifically, without the sort of worries of whether the water's going to flow in the wrong places and things like that. And this, I think, is a really good sort of way of utilizing these markers. It's a mixed media approach, of course, and purists, I'm sure, would prefer to stick to entirely watercolors, but I actually think the effect is rather fun. It really does, for me, work quite well. You can kind of almost dry brush, you can do these bigger marks, you can gesturally sort of throw the pen across the page, and you get a very different feel. And you can also change the sort of strength of the grey, if you like, going up and down different greys to provide lighter or darker shadows. Here I'm using it to really get those dark areas, to really shape some of these rocks and get that feel of just how steep things are. And the steepness, for me, I think comes from the degree of shadow. Also using it to create little marks in other places where I just think perhaps, like here on the left, it could just be a bit more interesting. It's just a bit, not much going on. And there are, if you look at the reference, there are those little tiny shadows. So I'm just inventing shadows, or maybe not inventing, but not strictly taking from the reference shadows to, again, enhance my vision for the art. I'm not saying this is the right thing to do, but I also am saying I do think it's a perfectly valid and good thing to do if that's what you want to do. And it's how I enjoy at this stage of my art. I enjoy referencing my art more than the reference photos. So I'm more focused on how can I improve this piece of art? How can I make it more interesting, rather than, you know, slavishly getting to this point and going, right, oh, it doesn't exactly match the reference. How am I going to correct it? Because when I start correcting and trying to make it perfect, I get stressed. My artwork looks stressed. And in watercolors, this is too late. And in ink, this is too late. Whatever is on the page is on the page. You're not going to correct it. You're only going to make it a little bit worse, a little bit more overworked, a little bit messy. And here now, finally, we come back to the normal sort of restructuring. And I'm still using the same pen. This is still an ultra extra fine nib, but because it's a gold nib, it's very flexible. You can see it can actually produce these really quite bold lines. And these bold lines let us again enhance that feeling of contrast by, you know, going round edges, by contrasting big sort of white areas against this bold black line. That enhances the feeling of white, enhances the feeling of light. It's just a visual trick, an optical illusion that our eyes are very willing to fall for. And we can just keep gently moving around the image, again, bit by bit, taking a sort of literal or a hypothetical step back, making sure we're not overworking in one area. This is also letting us pull things forward. It's hopefully bringing these shapes that I'm outlining into the very foreground. And again, hopefully that enhances the feeling of this being a really steep ridge coming towards us. And no, it is not perfectly capturing the exact shape that we see in our reference photo, but you know, this certainly reminds me of this strip. It certainly reminds me of that reference photo, and I've taken for me what are the key bits and the key ideas, and I've got them on my page in a relaxed and fun way. All that's left to do is just pick out a few bits and bobs, and really the main challenge here is to avoid overworking it. And before you know it, we are done. And as ever, what I'm going to do, put my little signature in there, put my initials in the corner, and basically I'm happy to say this is a fun sketch that I'm really proud of, and I would love you to join in. So if you do want to join in, check the reference. You can find it on my Pinterest. The link is down below, and also subscribe. You will find loads of tutorials, always fully in-depth, fully narrated, real-time, that you can sketch along and join in with. Have a good day and happy sketching. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.